I've always loved comic books because they allow us to step outside of ourselves. They let us see the world differently, and they also allow us to see other people differently as well. Comics allow us to imagine that the impossible might actually be possible, and they allow us to see people and places and events differently in new and fantastic ways, to see history differently, and to imagine a present that might be very different than it is today. And I love how comics allow us to see the human body in new ways as well, to see heroes who might look like us or even who might look very different from ourselves. I think superheroes are all about bodies that are different from our own because of their fantastic abilities, which makes them a powerful forum to celebrate difference on so many levels. And this is where I see comics as having major potentials for how we can conceptualize, confront, and fight against racism. Because comics allow us to ask, what if? What if things were different? What if a different choice had been made or a different event hadn't happened? How would the world and the relationships that people have with everyone in it be different today? I even grew up reading a Marvel comic with that very name, What If, in which we get to see how the Marvel universe would have been very different if some of the most important moments in Marvel history had been altered. Like, what if that radioactive spider had bitten somebody else besides Peter Parker? In this same way, comics can offer us a mental model for how we see the world differently and to see people from around the world differently as well. Comic books often do this by constructing richly detailed new cities and countries and even new worlds. They take us to places that inspire our imagination, like Metropolis and Gotham City and Wakanda and even Atlantis. But they don't just construct new lands and new worlds, they also construct new universes full of different worlds, and not just one universe, multiple universes, or what is known in comic book circles as the multiverse. Comic books have been doing this for decades, long before I was even born. In the 1960s, DC Comics had heroes from Earth 1 meet heroes from Earth 2, followed by countless numbers of different worlds in the decades that followed. And Hollywood has even started to see the potential of this as well, with films like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Marvel's bringing back all of the former actors who had previously played Spider-Man for a new movie, and DC's doing the same with many of the former Batman actors, as a way of tying together older versions of the same characters into one larger connected narrative universe, or rather a multiverse. And it's this idea of the multiverse that I see as holding so much potential when it comes to how storytellers can tell more anti-racist stories. The multiverse lets pop culture creators give audiences a much more diverse range of characters in comics, as well as in all of the movies and television shows and video games that come out of those comics. In both the world of comics and in the real world that you and I live in ourselves, the multiverse also offers us a powerful mental model for understanding the choices that were made throughout history in terms of whose voices were heard and whose were denied. Take DC Comics for a start. There's a lot of different universes in play, and the number has just kept growing since the 1960s. In one universe, Superman is a white man named Clark Kent, but in another universe, Superman is a black man named Harvey Dent. And in a different universe altogether, he's a black man named Calvin Ellis. And what I think is one of the biggest appeals of comic books is the way that they build new worlds for their creators and for their readers to explore. And in the media studies classes that I teach, we call this the process of world building, whereby a film or a book or a whole franchise creates its own narrative world with its own history and its own rules. And part of the fun of entering any new narrative world is in finding out what those rules are and how the backstory of that world's history affects how we understand its characters. This is just as true of a multimedia franchise like Star Wars as it is with novels like Lord of the Rings. figuring out everything about the world that it is set in is part of the fun. But with comic books, we get to explore not just one world, but multiple worlds in multiple universes using the multiverse approach. And if it's possible for there to be more than just one version of a particular hero, then that has major consequences for how different forms of personal identity can be represented, because it means that more people can be represented and more voices can be heard from. And what I think is so important about this is that if history can be thought of as a series of paths, either taken or not taken, and choices either made or not made, then the multiverse reimagines history as a process in which any and all paths and choices happen. We sometimes think of our present moment in history as the inevitable consequence of everything that has come before. But I think if we use the multiverse as a mental construct to help us understand how we got to where we are now, then we can see the past not as a series of inevitable moments in which certain causes had to lead to certain inescapable effects, but instead we can see it as a process in which one path was taken over another. But what if, as the Marvel comics of my childhood remind me, what if things had taken a different turn? How much earlier might we have arrived at certain moments of awareness or change that we ended up waiting on much longer? Think about if we apply this to popular culture. It's an interesting question to consider just how much sooner we might have potentially seen some of the changes in the media that we've only begun to see quite recently. What if, for example, in 1989, the Oscar for Best Picture had not gone to the film Driving Miss Daisy? That film was about an elderly woman in 1940s Georgia who isn't allowed to drive anymore, so she gets a chauffeur, played by Morgan Freeman. It was a controversial pick for how it represented racism in earnest but divisive ways. But what if the award had gone to another film from that same year that also tackled racism much more directly and much more powerfully? What if Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing had won Best Picture in 1989? Would Hollywood have started to look any different over the next 30 plus years? Driving Miss Daisy has not held up well over the years. And in 2015, the Hollywood Reporter took a poll of Academy Award voters. And it turns out that they would not have voted for Driving Miss Daisy for Best Picture all over again if given a second chance. But Do the Right Thing is still relevant and it's still powerful, and it's a film that I still teach over 30 years later. And yet, if it had been recognized as such in 1989 by the Oscars, how many more films like it might we have seen since then? So this, I think, is really just one such path not taken. And in the history of comic books themselves, there have been similar paths not taken that had major consequences for how characters and creators of color have been treated, even as far back as the 1940s. The history of American comic books saw relatively few Black characters throughout most of the 20th century, and so many of those that did exist were simply crude stereotypes. And while the various publishing companies that eventually formed what we know today as Marvel and DC Comics offered readers hundreds of white superheroes throughout the 1930s and 40s and 50s, not one was Black. You couldn't even find a series with a Black character in the starring role with their name on the title in any genre until about the mid-1960s. And in 1965, it was Dell Comics that introduced a character named Lobo. He was a gunfighter in the Old West and the first African-American character to have his or her own series. But it only lasted 2 issues because most distributors refused to sell it. They returned unopened bundles of the first issue rather than to allow a Black character to have a prominent place on newsstands. So comics about Black characters were regularly canceled in the name of poor sales when the real reason was entrenched racial discrimination. And the same thing happened in 1947 with the release of a comic book that was made solely by Black creators and featured only Black starring characters. It was created by writer and editor Orrin C. Evans, who was a longtime journalist from Philadelphia, who decided to create a comic book for Black readers, and the result was as remarkable as it was short-lived. And it featured the heroic adventures of characters like Lion Man and the detective Ace Harlem. Now, Evans' approach offered Black comic book fans stories that were steeped in experience and in civic engagement rather than just in thoughtless stereotypes. Evans' background in journalism and his commitment to the Black community gave him really a unique motivation as a comic book publisher. He was driven not just by profit, but also by the need for more diverse representations of Black identity. And in his opening editorial for the first issue of the series, he described how the scope and the tone of the issue's stories were very different from those found in books that were done by white creators, explaining that this comic offered a unique opportunity for Black readers and writers and artists alike. He said every brushstroke, every pen line in the drawings on these pages are by Black artists. And this then, he said, meant that the book gave a voice to Black creators in a way that the comic book industry had really never seen before. And Evans wrote each of the stories, while his brother, George J. Evans Jr., drew the adventures of Lion Man, who I've argued in my own research can actually be credited as the first African-American superhero, long before Marvel started creating Black superheroes in the 1960s. But as inspired as the book's content was, it was never given a chance to succeed. Philadelphia was one of only a few cities that actually saw the book make it onto newsstand shelves. And the reasons why a second issue was never published all add up to systemic oppression on the part of the comics industry and its distributors. And although a second issue was prepared, it never saw print. Evans was forced to abandon the series for several reasons. One is that newsprint vendors refused to sell to him, as well the company that printed the first issue wouldn't handle the second one, and other printers in the area refused to deal with him. Many distributors were afraid of angering the newsstand vendors who sold comics by offering them a product that might prove to be controversial with their white customers, which explains why so many copies never even made it onto newsstands in the first place. And Evans went back to being a journalist once he saw that his comic book could not succeed in the face of systemic racism in the 1940s. But here's where I see this mental model of the multiverse to again allow us to ask, what if? What if the series had not been shut down by the systemic racism of the publishing industry? Would popular culture be different today? What if heroes like Ace Harlem and Lion Man had thrived in the 1940s and into the modern era? Maybe by now we'd have multi-million-dollar film and television franchises built around Lion Man and Ace Harlem. Maybe by now kids would have grown up with a line of Lion Man and Ace Harlem action figures to inspire their imagination, just like I did when I had my Marvel and DC toys when I was a kid. So I really see this idea of confronting the world as it is now versus contemplating the world as it might have been as a powerful anti-racist tool. And it is a cognitive exercise, to be sure, but it forces us to never take the way things are today for granted, so that we never assume that the current status quo is simply the natural consequence of the past, or that things were always meant to be this way. So I really think taking a multiverse approach to history and to culture lets us confront how our current beliefs and biases and assumptions were formed, not only by our own personal choices and paths taken, but also by forces that are bigger than ourselves, bigger than just me and bigger than just you. Think about history as a story. You do that, think of history as a story, you can revise and retell that story in new ways. And this is what each generation has always done for centuries, as it passes down its knowledge to the next generation. Before anyone even knew how to write, this knowledge was passed down orally, and it was adjusted as needed so that it would endure. We reinterpret the past as we rethink the cause and effect of how we got to where we are today. Comic books do this all the time as creators rethink and revise the backstories of their characters, tweaking the origin stories for each new generation of readers. So I'll leave you with this. As we move forward telling stories about the world and the people who live in it, consider how we might retell those stories in a way that also takes into consideration the paths not taken and the voices that were silenced along the way. It's a mindset that allows us to now have more than just one Spider-Man, more than one Batman, and more than one Superman, thanks to the multiverse, allowing different cultures and different generations to have their own heroes who represent them. So if comic book multiverses let us see the world differently, imagine just how different our world might be in the years ahead if we start to apply multiversal thinking as a real-world anti-racist strategy.